Hello and welcome to today's 18 Group webinar on how to optimize and streamline regulatory reporting using outsourced and managed services. My name is Sarah Underwood. I'm an editor here at 18 Group and I'll be moderating the webinar. Our expert speakers today are Paul Lumsden, Head of Regulatory Technology Change and Product Owner at Janus Henderson Investors, Chris Beaver, UK MLRO and Group Compliance CEOO at GAM, James McKeon, Head of Industry Banking and Capital Markets at Snowflake, and Iadine Alfaki, Global Lead Trading and Risk Solutions at Luxoft. I'll ask them all to introduce themselves in just a couple of minutes, but first, just so that you can make most use of the webinar, in the Slido panel to the right of the video, we'll be running 3 polls during the webinar, so please do cast your vote so that we can see where the industry is on the topics that we're going to poll on. Also, there's a question section in the Slido bar, so please write your questions for our speakers there, and we'll gather them all up and put them to our speakers later on during the webinar. So please do take part. Always interested to know where you are at and how we can help you. So enough of me, and thank you for that. Let me come to our speakers to introduce themselves. And let's start with you, Paul, if we may. Please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your interests here.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paul Lumsden. I look after the regulatory technology change function at Janus Henderson. We're responsible for, although based in the UK, we're actually we've got a global outlook. So we're covering the regs and reg requirements for our business units across the globe where Janus Henderson offices are.
Thank you very much indeed. Over to you, Chris.
Hi, I'm Chris Beaver. I'm the UK MLRO and Group Compliance COO at GAM Investments, and I cover all of the financial crime, but any shared service from a compliance perspective globally within GAM Compliance as well.
Okay, thank you very much. And Steve? No, I got that wrong, James. So sorry.
No worries. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Sarah. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. So James McKeon, Head of Banking and Capital Markets here at Snowflake. My background comes 30 years of expertise across major banks, and hopefully helping contextualize the value of the underlying cloud, but obviously with a business context to leverage data for clients, especially within risk and reg reporting.
Thank you very much indeed. And Iadine.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Hi, everyone. My name is Iadine. So I lead the trading and risk solutions for Luxoft based in London. So we are a technology and consulting company. We have built partnership with around 12 different platforms. Plus we have our internal bespoke capabilities to create end-to-end regulatory reporting and risk management solutions. And that covers financial services, risk management to regulatory operational risk.
Okay, thank you all very much indeed, and let's get going. But let's start with an audience poll question. It is, what is the state of regulatory reporting at your organization? And while you vote for your perhaps not favored answer, your answer, let me come over to Paul to talk about how he sees the state of play on regulatory reporting in capital markets.
Sure. Well, I don't think it will be any surprise to say, or you hear me say, that it's certainly a very challenging environment right now, has been for some time, and will continue to be for some time as well, just for all financial institutions. The regulatory landscape is constantly shifting right now. As I said earlier, we're based in the UK, but we have a global perspective on the regulations that impact our business in other countries as well. And there is conflicting different types of regulation within these geographic locations. So this really makes it challenging. It's difficult as well with the horizon scanning as well, keeping ahead of that change curve. So within the industry at the moment, just keeping an eye on what is going on within the horizon itself, within the industry itself, is quite difficult. The regulatory obligations as well, I think they're becoming more transparent, require more transparency. This is introducing more complexity, and it seems certainly from our perspective, where we see it, and in terms of implementation we're doing, those implementations are becoming tougher, and the timeframes are becoming shorter to get regulation implemented as well. So all in all, I think it's certainly a very challenging state of play in the industry at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. James, how do you see this when you're out and about in the market?
Yeah, I can only agree and concur with Paul's view, but just a slightly different pivot, right? So as he mentioned, the continual change in complexity and the timelines that people have to meet. But I think what it really has drawn a focus on is, given that interest rates have changed 500 plus basis points in roughly a year, it's the ability to allocate resources appropriately. And regulatory pulls people away from their typically revenue generating functions, right? Now, the nice piece of all this is that I think that what has happened since the great financial crisis has enabled some more stability in the marketplace with the largest, biggest banks and others. But the reality is that how do people, as the landscape continues to change, how do they actually prioritize their time, resource appropriately? Again, the only upside that I see for all this is that the regulations are focused in the right areas, right? Hopefully with a bit more focus on liquidity versus simply just on the credit side. But we're seeing that the correlation between the regulations and the risk and risk reduction is obviously a very good thing for the firms at the end of the day. If they manage this process well, it will help them with their core business of managing risk. And then hopefully with that, again, financial services is predicated on trust. And I think that if people can't be seen to be doing things well from a regulatory standpoint, that will impact your business directly as well. So it really is directly linked back to sustainability and viability of your revenue and client stream. So I think pulling it all together, essential focus, resource allocation is essential. But I think moving forward that the focus on the risk side is what's going to help getting the dual effort from your client side of the business, just from simply moving away from regulatory reporting. Okay, let's see where our audience is here. Please maybe see the poll results. And James, perhaps you'd like to comment on these. It's not a lot of voters yet. Let's see. So pretty good, satisfactory, needs work. Does that seem sensible to you? It does. And I think maybe there's a positive bias to the fact that some of the recent ripples, what translated out of what happened with Silicon Valley Bank and some of the other recent banking stresses, didn't take down the whole system, right? So that shows that the regulation is working, while recognizing that there was some significant oversights around the stress testing that should have happened moving forward. So not surprising, but I would argue that I would have thought there'd been a few more needs work, just from the idea of the actual operational mechanisms to pull off the regulatory reporting from as I mentioned before, a human capital standpoint within their businesses. Okay, thank you very much indeed for that, and thank you for voting. Let me come over to Iadine and bring you in now. Why is now the time to invest in changes to regulatory reporting?
So I'll take first. It's really a very important moment for the industry right now, mainly because the increasing number of regulation and the level of complexity they're getting into. I still remember in 2008-9, we're still doing like maybe one regulation every 2 years, like Dodd-Frank at the time, and banks took time to understand, to interpret, do the interpretation of regulation, and then build the systems around it. We can't afford that anymore. If I take MiFID, for example, is going to MiFID 1, 2, 3. We have the S+1 in the US. So there's an increasing number of regulatory requirement. Also on new industries, if we take in the energy, commodity and energy business, for example, on renewable energies, there's a new set of reporting and a new set of data, a new ecosystem actually that needs to be understood, interpreted, and also implemented in terms of front to back, the entire trade life cycle. That's in its extremely complex in terms of resources, in terms of bandwidth and ability to deliver. So doing this in the old way will not work, and it's technology on the other side is bringing solutions in terms of managing a huge volume of data, in terms of real-time AI, machine learning, bringing new levels of efficiency. So it's, as I said, together with cloud, that's the perfect timing for all organizations to explore new ways of remaining compliant, and compliance shouldn't eat on the business growth and the business priority of companies. They need to whatever time available or budgets available need to be prioritized to deliver, to find the new markets, to deliver new revenue, but still they need to maintain the compliance, and they need to find ways on how to do it. As I said, leveraging, maybe we'll see later, RegTech and the new technologies.
Okay, fantastic. Chris, as a practitioner, is it time to invest in this complexity?
Yes, I think so. I think, as mentioned, I think the sheer volume of change.
Can you speak up a little bit, Chris?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I think
Well,
the
thank
sheer
you.
volume of change coming down the pipe is probably one of the issues. I think there's also big opportunities with regulators as well, where they're looking
You're not
at how
hearing
they
very
can,
well, Chris.
apologies. Yeah, there's opportunities with regulators where I think they're participating in industry-wide events in terms of how more automation and more machine type of reporting can be used as well. So I think you've got opportunities. I think there's changes to the existing regimes, whether that's MiFID, OTC type regimes, but I also think there's a large amounts coming down in the ESG type space as well, which I think is just going to increase it. So I think, yes, it is time to invest, because I think it's only going to increase around it. And apologies if you couldn't catch any of that. I'll try and work on my microphone.
That's okay. You said spending will increase because more complexity, more regulation. Yeah. I think that reflects some of the things that James said indeed. So at this point, let's run another poll question, and this time it talks about the challenges of regulatory reporting at your organization. So while you vote, and this time please vote or tick the boxes of as many boxes as are relevant to your organization. Let me come back to Paul to talk about the toughest challenges of regulatory reporting that financial institutions are facing at the moment.
I think, so if I talk from my sort of frontline view, and possibly with, well, I definitely have spoken with a number of peers around this, regulatory reporting is considered to be a burden within organizations. I've heard terms like basic hygiene, which is it's a little bit more than basic hygiene, and it's got a little bit more importance within the organization. And I really think we need to change the mindset of leadership teams in organizations to maybe consider that there is actually opportunity to be gained. I think there's going to be a little bit talk a little bit later on about market benefits to be gained from it. There's definitely opportunity to be gained. If you think, for example, the data sets that we all use for the reporting, the reg reporting, the accuracy that you've got to have, it's just it's non-negotiable. We can surely use this to our benefit within the organization. We can enhance other processes like our client reporting, the information we provide to clients. So I think making regulatory reporting seen as an opportunity rather than burden is one of the key things. It's work that's ongoing. It's not an easy sell. We will get there because it does make sense in my view, and certainly in some of the peers I've spoken to, it's their view as well. So I think that's one thing. I think another thing particularly is we've talked about complexity and the increase in the number of regulations, just the sheer volume of information we're expected to move around the industry now is quite staggering. And it's at the moment there's some commonality in the formats we use, but there's also a lot of difference in the formats that we use. So we're an asset manager. We manage money. We're not a data provider as such. So It's things like that are quite challenging for us as an asset manager to move these enormous volumes of information around the industry. And then finally, I'd say one of the other, again, a more general issue is the numbers of queries and support that come from both internally and externally now. So again, with that complexity, the deeper dive of the regulations, what's required of them, people internally, the educational programs that need to be established to help people understand in plain English what these regulations are asking for is certainly challenging. And externally as well, distributors, platforms, data aggregators, we find ourselves working a lot more and providing a lot more support to our external partners to give them more information and really give them more understanding of the information that we're providing them as well.
Okay, James, would you concur with some of that? What are you seeing in terms of what your clients are struggling with particularly?
Yeah, and Paul is on the front lines, and I obviously, as a technology provider, get to see a bit of a wider purview. So Paul, coming from the buy side of the house, I'm working with a lot of people within the broker dealer and in the world's largest banks, even from the smallest credit union up to, you know, a JP Morgan or the largest GSIBs that exist. Really, I see the challenges around two areas. One's already been touched on. So it's the continual change, but secondarily, it's the technology challenges, right? So, and Paul's alluded to this, but it's the harmonization of all the data elements, first of all. And I think if you focusing a bit upwards, if you're across a very large financial institution, both buy or sell side, the level of complexity that sits in the organizationally is predicated based upon sort of the different lines of business, federated decision-making, resourcing processes, and what you're having is in typically growth by acquisition, right? We've seen bank consolidation where their growth strategies become acquisitions, right? So you have all this legacy infrastructure. How do you then unify all of that? You have these data silos, which you have to break down, and then all of the cleansing of the data and all of the pieces that happen behind that. All of that time and effort that is being not only focused on what people perceive to be a non-business focused function for regulatory reporting, it's one of those pieces that the underlying quality of the information received creates its own challenges on a reconciliation front. So I think from a technology standpoint, it's the unification of information, the quality checks that have to be done. That's the effort and time that people are placing in this. The same thing they're doing for their data science workloads for a business sense, they have to be doing that reconciliation and quality control for the regulatory reporting. And again, the second point, which has been hit on quite well, is really that continual change, right? When the bar and the regulation moves frequently, when you start on one path to harmonize your data across one data format, and then it actually changes partway through, or you have additional requirements that get placed, that obviously is difficult, especially at a global organization with all of the regional, all of the regional requirements and specificity in that light.
Right. Okay. There's a lot going on indeed. So maybe see the poll results, please. And Iadine, would you perhaps like to comment on this? Does that surprise you particularly as the challenges our audience is facing?
No, so we see data silos, and that's quite important. I did mention this earlier, but legacy platforms have been built on different databases owned by different areas of any organization, especially the large ones. And today there are challenges on how to mutualize or normalize a bit that data formatting. So that's a real point. And I alluded earlier to the frequency of regulatory changes that is increasing. Too much manual intervention, that's correct, but a bit more related to the data quality and the need to correct that data, sometimes even correct the report manually. And definitely that's not a sustainable nor scalable. A lack of budget and resources, that is a consequence of the upper ones. There's more work. Always banks working under budget constraints, so that's something that pop-ups all the time. Yeah,
okay,
so
yeah,
it makes sense.
Okay, thank you. And staying with you, Iadine, how can outsourced or managed services help resolve some of these problems? Because obviously our audience is having these problems all the time, and it's very challenging, and they don't go away as things get bigger and more complex. How can How can third-party services help?
Yes, I think Paul did mention two important elements earlier. First one is standardization and templates. Outsourcing means theoretically, at least on paper, that when we outsource we'll see later selection criteria for how to select a relevant outsourcing company for regulatory reporting. But the idea there is we give this work to someone or a company that has experience in building those regulatory reports. So there's an accelerator factor. And instead of starting from an empty page, someone will come with a pre-done work, pre-formatted work that will accelerate the time to market. The second element is the learning. I think that, Paul, that's the second element he mentioned is there's a new regulation, and there's two parts. One is the interpretation of the regulation, what it means for that specific business, and the same regulation will have a different meaning for an asset manager, for a bank, for an energy trader. There's some common part, but that's some variations depending on the asset classes. For example, if we talk about financial services or financial assets, kind of underlying regulatory, so that interpretation is important. But it takes time, expertise, and that expertise is not there on the market. This is most of the time regulations that are defined at central bank levels, and there's very few experts who are good in there. So outsourcing means also having access to someone who probably did this somewhere else, and that will accelerate the process. So outsourcing will bring that acceleration part. There's another element which is cost saving, because again, there's a lot of regulations and some of them are more complex to others, and this investment in technology in people. So outsourcing means we will pay only for the usage. If it's a complex regulation, we will pay a certain amount. If it's a simple one, we'll pay less. So that's also the variety of the cost. The transparency on the cost is something that most of the organizations are looking at currently.
Okay, thank you. Chris, again, as a practitioner, how do you see these external services helping you?
I would completely agree that I think
so I think there's an issue with the microphone. Maybe I'm not the only one here in this. Yeah, so it's maybe just remove it.
Okay. Do you want to turn your video off for a moment, Chris, and let's see if we get a bit more
let me
noise
try
out.
That. Hopefully that might help with the bad
That's
reception.
a little better. Speak loudly. Lovely.
Cool.
Thank you.
Cool, no problems. And so I would completely agree in terms of the resource, expertise, standardization you're going to get from a third-party provider around that. So I think there's definitely encouragements in being able to use the providers around that. I think removing some of the complexity is really important in terms of understanding how you manage these processes, particularly when you're looking at the reconciliations and the controls, because I think they're some of the critical pieces you can get advantage from outsourcing or managed service. I think just putting my kind of practical head on, I think there's a couple of bits you've got to be very conscious of in this space. Is you can't remove the accountability and the risk for that. So you can outsource the process, but you've got to be able to manage the risk, and working with your provider to give you the right information to be able to manage that is one of the critical processes around it. And I think the key bit at the outset is being clear on what the expectations of what you are outsourcing or having managed and what you're not getting. I've seen a number of these areas that have worked really, really well, but all of a sudden there's a process or an exception that happens that's never been agreed either contractually or process-wise, and you can end up in all sorts of problems from that space. So I think making sure you've got a good relationship, you're very clear on the expectations, but I believe you get really good advantages from using third-party providers, whether that's an outsource as a managed service, particularly as I say in the standardization and the expertise and access to resources, which can be very expensive to either source or train in-house.
Okay, thanks very much indeed, Chris. And James, what would you add to that?
Yeah, without being repetitive, I'll take it from the business lens, and it's something I think that Paul really hit on smart before. It's this change of mindset that you can outsource, right? But it's also, there's a business outcome to all of this, right? And again, higher cost of capital markets, people focus on efficiency. If you are truly getting best practice and expertise, having that assurance, you still own the end of the risk at the end of the day, but can you then have your team focused on your core mission of being an asset manager, delivering investment, performance and return, or from a bank managing your overall risk and your overall book better so that you stay in business. And I think it's really important to have that mindset not just from an efficiency standpoint, but recognize that this is the reputational risk of your firm. And obviously, clearly, focusing your eyes on managing your own internal risk while making certain that best practices are being handled for reg reporting, and I'll use the term assurance, right, to make sure that happens. And I think that those are the things from a line of business standpoint that hopefully can be positive to the bottom line, both with your external clients from a trust standpoint, but then while having a productivity and efficiency standpoint to the bottom line with your existing employees.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. So great advantage in using third-party services, managed services, or perhaps outsourced services. And coming back to you, Chris, what then are the challenges and opportunities of using these third-party services? Nothing is perfect. It is, as you say, a change, and there are things to watch out for.
Hopefully the video and microphone is
You're very quiet again, sorry.
Okay, let me get rid of the video again then.
Thank you.
So I think in terms of the challenges, as I mentioned, you've got the complexity, you can't have...
You're still quite quiet, Chris, sorry.
Apologies. I think in terms of the opportunity...
Sorry, Chris, can you just hold a minute? You're very, very quiet. Can you speak a little louder, please?
Yeah, I'm trying to. Hopefully that's better. In terms of opportunities, I think the
Seems to be coming and going a bit.
language.
Chris, let me move on to our next speaker on this one while you try and work out your audio. That'd be great. And let me come to you, Paul. What are the challenges and opportunities once you get to managed services and outsourcing?
Sure. I think just to pick up with something James said about reduction of risk, and I think using a third-party vendor does help with that process. By you can really look at your overall operating model and put some of that risk onus for delivery of the reports, put that out to the third-party vendor. So there's an opportunity to do that. Where I would be cautious, and I'll be careful here because I spent a number of years in the vendor market, so I don't wish to shoot myself in the foot. But one of the things that I've seen is vendors trying to offer everything. There is no one size fits all. This is where I think this is really, really important, because we talked about the complexity of the regulatory landscape, keeping track of those latest changes, the horizon scanning. The requirements around that are quite significant. So really, when you're looking at working with a vendor, it's looking for the subject matter expertise. I would say that is one of the challenging things. The other opportunity is going back to that operating model and being able to look at it and say, well, we've got sort of standard reporting. We maybe have some bespoke customer reporting where one of our clients is looking to receive regulatory data, but it's on a bespoke basis. We maybe have to do a bit of manual intervention there. So again, back to reducing the risk, making the process easier. Get that standard reporting out to a subject matter expert, to that vendor that really understands what has to be done, and get that process going. And then you can focus on your client delivery and make sure you're getting the best reports, the best data through to your clients.
Okay, Yadin, what would you add there as a vendor? What do you see as the more difficult parts of it and the better parts of it from your customer's perspective?
Yes. So outsourcing actually is positive, as we said earlier, but it creates a side effect, which is increased dependency. So the bank will become more dependent and more reliable on the regulatory reporting provider. So that, again, selection of that provider, the outsourcer, is quite important, because the bank doesn't want to take the risk of working with a failing solution. So that's a major risk. And underlying of it is data security also, having access to probably sensitive data. But I think those both risks are being addressed by the industry. For example, the data confidentiality today, when it's put on cloud, for example, public cloud provide a good level of assurance that that data is well protected, but still it's it's one of those traits that any bank or financial institution needs to look at. And the last one is probably that I have in my mind is the level of customization. So by default, when we select, I think, a solution, software or regulatory reporting provider, there's some work and pre-configuration work that is done that comes with a kind of level of standardization, then to which extent that can be tailored to the specific requirement of the bank, of the asset manager. That also needs to be there while assessing different solutions, because some of the solutions there on the market were done quickly and they don't offer a good level of customization. So that can create also limitations in terms of the quality of the regulatory reports that are created in the end.
Okay, thank you both very much indeed. And Paul, coming back to you, please would you provide some practical guidance on how to switch from internally to externally supported regulatory reporting? I don't suppose it's a big bang approach, but I may be wrong.
No, I guess definitely not really. I think one of the things that I would have done and I'm doing first in this process would be, we've talked about data for many years, 20 plus years on sessions like this with A-Team and other through other conferences, but data is actually, it still is at the heart of the discussion. It's at the heart of the conundrum. We should catalog the data. This would be the one sort of bit of guidance I would give, is catalog your data as a first part of the exercise. It's important to understand what data you're going to need for what regulations. Create a matrix, look for crossover, look for reusability. So before you've even started the process, changing the operating model, decided whether you want to maybe outsource standard reporting or put custom reporting onto a managed service platform, look at that data first, really understand your data. Then there's the nice to haves, I think, with getting the lineage and understanding where that data is. And there are technologies out there that can help you do that now that perhaps previously it was in Excel. Some of it may still be in Excel. Of course, I shouldn't assume that it's not, but there are technologies out there that would allow you to really visualize data moving from internally to a destination. And also the other piece of the jigsaw to have in place, importantly, is understanding of the ownership of your data and the governance of that data. So those for me are three very important things. And then from there, you can then decide how you move forward and what bits you wish to move from an internal to an external, from your internal process to external processes.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Paul. That's very helpful. And coming over to you, Iadine, talk to us a little bit, if you would, about the types of RegTech solutions and technologies that are useful here, both from a consumer and a vendor kind of perspective.
Yeah, so it's an interesting question, and actually, what we advise our partners and banks to do is to address the matrix of their priorities in terms of regulatory and needs, and then make sure that they have a good coverage across different solutions. So in that kind of matrix, definitely we will have something around data, but we see that most of the banks have something around there, how to manage huge volumes of data, how to categorize it, how to take more intelligence out of that data, making it uniform. So definitely that will remain an important topic. The second one is the quality of that data. And that goes, for example, if we take the ESG right now, ESG is an open data kind of available there. And quality is a big question. So there are a lot of RegTech and startups that use AI and machine learning to compare that data from across different sources and give a kind of scoring on the quality of that data. So that's important. And the earlier we clean the data, the cheaper it is and the better it is in terms of reporting, so that we capture any issue early enough. And that goes from the ESG example to QIC, for example, or AML, while onboarding new customers to do this upfront assessment of quality. I'll move to another part, which is more pricing, calculation capabilities, especially if we talk about risk management related regulations. If we take FRTB, for example, a few years ago, there were big questions around how to resolve that huge need for calculation. Is it through cloud, is infrastructure, or through algorithms? And there are different solutions on how to address that. And they'll end by what everyone wants today is a predictive view on risk, because in the end, what we're talking about here is a decision-making process. It's not just about producing a report and sending it to a regulator. It's about capturing any risk on the financial institution in terms of business, and making sure the right decisions are done early enough in the process so that we don't reach the risk. That will be the ideal world. So anything related to predictive monitoring, something that allows to make capture that possible risk early enough and address it properly, that will be really something with a great business additional value. And we see this in regulatory reporting. We see it also in the liquidity management, intraday liquidity management kind of topics. So that predictive aspect is very important.
Okay. Paul, from your perspective, are there particular companies or types of RegTech and technologies that are helpful here?
I think Idine there just articulated it very well. Sort of the solutions that are useful. If I could just pull one of those points that he made around the calculations. This is particularly onerous for us as an institution, for other institutions, and that calculation process is something that it's useful when you can find a technology or solution that gives you that can do those calculations. It's got to be robust. It's got to be able to consume large amounts of data. You need transparency. You need to be able to verify that calculation as well, and you need a validation layer. So these are, whether it's whether it's cloud-based, on-premise, it's debatable. It depends on the strategy, the IT strategy of the individual organization. But for me, I have to have something where I can get these calculations done. So this is really quite key for me. So well, from what Idine said, there is that for me is something that is very useful in terms of RegTech solutions.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And let's take a break here for some audience questions. And they touch on some of the things we've talked about and a few new things too. And if I may, Paul, let me come back to you first. The first one: how can we build a business case to outsource reg reporting?
I think it's so building that business case is down to it. Well, it's you've got to look at your operating model first. I really just take a step back and look at how you're doing things right now, what's working, what's not working, and then understanding why something may not be working, and equally why it is working as well, I should say. So from there, you can then start to build that business case, and you can start, and you need to speak with the business stakeholders and understand where they sit, where their requirements are, and are we going to benefit by putting everything out the door? Are we going to benefit by putting something out the door? What is the best way of doing that? So, but it all comes down to looking at your operating model as it is now. You need to look at it on a global perspective. You've got to create an inventory of regulations and understand what your individual organization, what is its regulatory obligations? Is it transactional based reporting? Is it client based regulatory reporting? Look at the different types of regulation there, and then just gradually build up, and that'll help develop your thought process, and then will allow the business case to evolve. And then you can then decide, well, actually, this is the standard reporting we have. This is where we recommend it goes to outsourcing, but we want to hold on to this bit because it is better for us as an organization, competitive advantage, whatever it happens to be, to keep that in-house. So it's really, for me, again, look at that operating model.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And I'm going to ask James this one. It says, to what extent do outsourced and managed service providers have the knowledge and expertise to handle regulatory change. Again, something we touched on earlier. There is a limit on expertise in our industry. So how do the third parties gain that expertise, and do they have enough to manage regulatory change?
So Sarah, that's to me, yes?
Yeah.
Great. No, so I may take a little tact on this, and I think from a regulatory expertise standpoint, I think you're typically pulling people from the industry, right, who have sat in the seat, who have the expertise. I wanted to pivot a little bit back to some of the comments that Iadine had made, that there's no question that this is a big data problem. And I think that, as alluded to by Paul, I think it's the idea of, especially within a very conservative financial services industry, if you are outsourcing, is there expertise? Great. So assuming you have that checked off, but how can you help it scale better than what exists already? And I think this is where we're starting to see some of the challenges around, especially for the regulatory workloads around capital adequacy and liquidity, such as FRTB and CCAR. We're seeing trends in the industry look to the cloud to be part of that capability, especially if you want to have the governance and explainability. Because I think the modeling, to Paul's point, is it's essential to be able to explain how you come up with these risk calculations and how it was done. And this is where existing technology likely is suffering, and it's not providing the efficiency that is needed and the ability to meet the SLAs required for a proper reg reporting. So again, I'm happy to defer to others in their own piece about, I think bringing people in to the consulting industry that have come from sitting at major banks or worked on the buy side, such as Paul has, is I think where that pool of talent will be and continues to come from. But I think part of this is, again, still the big data problem of the quality and the ability to ingest the volume, variety, and veracity of data with the right directional pointing to then meet the specific regulations as required. But there's no question we're seeing a trend to the cloud to become that scalable layer for the predictions and the capabilities, both from a business lens and a reg lens, to make sure that you understand your underlying risk positions, should anyone ask, to avoid that negative reputational risk. Okay,
fine. Chris, perhaps one for you as a practitioner. Are you in place? Let's see, I'll put it to you. Let me know if, how the audio is going. And it asks, the reporting responsibility stays with the FI, as we've mentioned before. So what happens if the third party gets things wrong? What happens then?
You can't get rid of the responsibility. Even if the third party gets it wrong, it's still your responsibility as reportable to the regulator to fix it. So as we mentioned earlier, you can't outsource the responsibility. So you've got to make sure the data you're providing and getting back from the third party provider allows you to articulate whatever issue you've got to the regulator where necessary. Around it. So there are massive advantages from an operational and a change perspective, but from the pure regulatory perspective, nothing changes. You've still got that responsibility ultimately.
Okay, and back to you, Paul, with a similar kind of question, and it says, please panel talk a little about how to build a strong relationship, and one of the vendors might want to step in after Paul has spoken, with an external reporting provider, and how do you monitor it?
That's a good question. I think it's the first. I guess it's building an element of trust between the two parties. That is the first the first step. So you've got to understand how that vendor works, and that vendor needs to understand how you work. These are kind of obvious statements, I think, but it's these are really important to a long-term relationship. There is, I think, when you're doing selection of a vendor, there is an industry tendency, certainly in the industry we work in, to drop through RFIs, RFPs. You need something documented as part of your assessment process. You have to show due diligence has taken place with the vendor. But I think it really starts with doing practical examples with the vendor and getting them to replay, pick some of your difficult scenarios that you're perhaps struggling with right now, and not big old shopping list, but perhaps pick 3 or 4 and ask them to replay how they would approach those, and that gives you a much better idea of what functionality the vendor has, what they can do, and that trust starts to build up, and then it makes it a lot easier to maintain an oversight with that relationship as well. So if you're starting off on that strong base and then going through, and then I think I've certainly mentioned it a couple of times, but horizon scanning, market expertise, for me, is key in the vendors. I look for that expertise, because that's going to help me through. We have teams of people that are internally within our organization, might be responsible, but for that process, but they can't cover everything. So the vendor has got an outward looking view on the world as well. So we would see that as being a very important requirement as part of the service that can be provided.
Okay. James, would you like to add to that from a vendor's perspective?
Just coming off of mute. No, I think, I can't disagree. I think the part of all of this is really understanding your goals and the mindset you wish to approach here, right? So, and how you step into that process, right? And I think, as what is the goals? What's the outcome? Is it really risk mitigation for the firm and productivity overall? And then the biggest piece, and I think Paul started to touch on it, is how you're going to implement for success here. To me, it's the prioritization around where's the biggest risk. And again, some of the biggest banks I talk to run into those spiky month-end workloads for an FRTB or CCAR that, again, have become the challenge of their existing systems. So if we do have to triage something, where are you focusing? And where is that the most significant reputational risk to your firm? And I think that's where, as you do implement this strategy and you're doing your qualifications, as Paul highlighted, okay, then where do you direct those resources to prioritize first? And I would argue that's obviously in the wake of Credit Suisse, a 170-year-old institution that no longer exists is through a series of risk management failures. And I think that this has become a business viability essentiality to understand it's not just reg reporting as an expense. It's become to your business viability and your trust between clients moving forward. So again, if I had to harness it more time, what are your goals? Rewire your mindset change to the focus on not just reg, but business prioritization, and then implementation. Where do you focus first? And I think those are my steps.
Okay, let's move on and come back to my questions. But thank you so much to our audience for your questions and to our speakers for their answers. Let's run a final audience poll, if we may. This one asks, to what extent would optimized and streamlined regulatory reporting extend business advantage at your organization? So while you select your answer, let me come to Chris to talk a little bit about how he sees the benefits of an optimized and streamlined regulatory reporting system, which is probably partially outsourced at least.
Yeah, I think the big advantages are cost, time, and just a business attention. If I think back to the amount of time that our traders, the COO, compliance operations spend, particularly fixing issues, looking at requirements, and particularly if we've got remediation projects. So there's a big overhead in terms of those activities. Obviously, being able to manage the risk is a big important aspect, but I think there's some additional nuances you get. So being able to scenario test, as was mentioned earlier, being able to look at different cases and things like that, by having a streamlined and optimized process, you can do different testing. You're not constantly fixing. You can start looking at forward going business. I think the last few years, so many organizations have spent so much time looking backwards at the data and trying to fix the data that we're forgetting we're trying to run a business that's looking ahead around it. So I think the big piece will lead to commercial aspects, but it's usually saving time and money and people around it generally.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And James, when you're out there in the market, what do you see the benefits? What are your customers accruing?
Yeah, and I think for the sake of being repetitive, but I think it's there are many common elements that obviously reside back into the regulatory piece that are core to the underlying business of understanding risk. I think people's hedging books as we can see from the significant change in interest rates and the volatility of markets, these are all correlating and go hand to hand, right? So I think this can't only be seen as just putting a report out the back end. It's really unifying into a common source of data, right? Breaking down the data silos, getting the quality of the information in a holistic sense, and then being able to run your consistent modeling on a single source of truth of information, right? That has a governance and explainability process that can be done, right? With the governance to have it securely done. And I think to Iadine and Paul's points, that underlying modeling and stress testing scenarios that you have to be able to do these days, right? Even if there is a regulatory breakdown and an oversight that the Fed or others aren't doing, that's no excuse at your own end. Your shareholders and stakeholders require that you're doing this and looking at all scenarios and all decision trees appropriately. So there's no question that to extend the business advantage here, first of all, it just has to be a common source of information, and really having the appropriate modeling with explainability on a governed platform is how we're seeing the way to extend that business advantage.
Okay, thank you very much indeed to both of you. And maybe we see the poll results. And Paul, can I throw you into this one? This is what our audience say. Yep. Okay. Yeah. What do you think? Is that feasible? That they're 67% would expect significant advantage.
That's well, bearing in mind the commentary we had earlier, and where I raised about the challenge of regulatory reporting being seen as an opportunity. That's quite a surprising number who consider it to be significant. They'll get significant business advantage. That's great news, because that means the views are changing in terms of regulatory reporting and its overall benefits to the organisation and the reuse of that information. So that's good to see.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for that, and everybody, thank you for voting. And coming back to you, Iadine, this is something we have talked about. We talked about in the questions, and I'll just run over it quickly so we can sum up. And the question is, how can FIs working with our third parties ensure they'll have the ability to achieve a regulatory change, whether they're small or big, the regs are big or small? And I think we touched on this in terms of the skills. Is that how would you would see that also?
Yeah, exactly. So skills are important, but I'll just extrapolate that to full due diligence on the outsourcing company in terms of, especially for large organizations. I think it's important to have some location synergy. Like if a bank or any financial institution operates in some locations, it's important that the outsourcer understands those jurisdictions and is able to accompany the financial institution into those different jurisdictions. Otherwise, it will be either not perfect, or the bank or asset manager will have to sign with different outsourcers. And once that due diligence is done and there's trust established, and I think the word trust was mentioned a few times earlier, and it's quite important. Because we're talking here not only about outsourcing a low priority activity, we're talking about things that can impact penalties, image of the financial institution, and reputation on the market. So it's a very important actually activity that is being outsourced, and it's very important that there's as a success criteria to have continuous communication channels. So they shouldn't be perceived as we signed the contract with a company, it's outsourced, and then we just see a report every end of every month. There should be a kind of governance where the financial institution has access to the product roadmap, to decision makers, to maybe even the owners of that outsourcing company, if it's a small company, to be able to influence the product roadmap and to make sure that the requirements are prioritized and there's an alignment in terms of vision and also priority. Yeah? So to make sure that that underlying technology used by the outsourcing company is something that allows a quick time to market, and no one will be locked at one point of time with an unfeasible work. So yeah, so it needs a lot of internal work to understand the priorities, and from there, as I said, due diligence and then proper governance with the outsourcing company.
Okay, James, you talked about the expertise elements earlier. Anything more to add here?
Yeah, I think to Iadine's point, I think it's really about the due diligence you have to do here, right? You are putting not only trust, but you're putting your reputation on the line through a third party, right? So I think it's he's hit it very well, but to drill it to one more point, it's having some empirical evidence and backup around the SLA delivery, right? And the quality control with evidence from other similarly positioned institutions like yourselves to meet timelines with the accuracy, right? So I think that is where I would go, because nobody wants to have a single point of failure or anything on the reg side, given the downside risk. So.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you both very much indeed. And coming to our final question today, I'd like to ask all our speakers to offer some advice for practitioners working to optimize and streamline regulatory reporting using third-party providers. And Chris, would you like to start here?
Yep, happy to. And apologies if this sounds simplistic, but I think the key parts are be clear on what your success factors are, what you're trying to achieve, and what are the risks and the downsides. Probably the most important thing, try to understand what you'll be comfortable living without. What are the trade-offs you can live with from a process and a risk perspective? I think too many try to do everything too perfectly, and the reality is you're probably never going to get to perfect. So it's being able to understand what can you live with that will reduce the risk, the cost, etc. But be very clear what you're trying to achieve.
Thank you very much indeed. Over to you, Paul. Oh, you've got your mute on.
Nearly a perfect
full
house. Yeah. So I think we've talked about these throughout, but perhaps just to I would say just highlight it. Three things. One is retain ownership of your data. I think this is key, and I think Chris alluded to it earlier, with the having control over that, and the having the responsibility for your data. But also we talked about business advantage and reusability of that data. It's your data, you understand it, keep control of it. The second thing would then be to say, catalog that data. But you create that data catalog because you want a part of that ownership, part of that control that you keep there. Catalog it, understand, create that matrix, understand where you've got crossover points, because if you're going to want to reuse that data in some form or other. So you need to understand the matrix of information and the crossover of that data. And I think probably the third thing for me would be to look for a vendor that is the subject matter expert. So there isn't the phrase we used earlier, or I used earlier, was one size. There's no one size fits all. The vendor needs to be a subject matter expert in the particular area. If you're looking at systemic risk regulatory reporting, if you're looking at client focused regulatory reporting, look for a vendor partner that can provide you with that level of expertise in those areas. Go for a best of breed approach. That would be my advice, because you're going to need that a good collective of expertise going forward.
Thank you, Paul, and over to you, James.
Yeah, and I may touch on a few points again. I think everyone said many things that are extremely valuable from I'm going to keep things a bit more high level, but just given the underlying background and the volatility in the markets, right? Bad news spreads like wildfire, right? Silicon Valley Bank had $140 billion leave in less than two days, right? So I think understanding what you're trying to accomplish on the regulatory and risk side, recognizing that risk management leads to your business viability. But I think to bring all this together, it's really understanding what you're hoping to achieve on the outside and what's the prioritization thereof, right? And then choosing a partner that both has understanding of their data, right, with the ability to meet these targets, with implementation success, right? Verifiable information from similarly positioned clients that can show you that they can handle all of these data elements with scale to meet SLAs, to keep your name out of the newspaper.
Okay, yeah, Dean, what would you say?
Yeah, so quickly, I think today we use the word in outsourcing managed service. Probably next time we'll be using the word ecosystem and partnership. So I think it's important to think about this as a best of breed kind of skills, as Paul said, and it's a set of solutions that are here to help any institution to remain compliant. some of them will disappear, some of them will merge. So we need to remain open-minded to that, take control from an institution perspective then on the needs, and then leverage this ecosystem the way it needs, and it has to be evolutive and agile over time. So I would use the word in partnership and ecosystem for this.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you. Nice close.
Thank you.
So thank you indeed to all our speakers for sharing your expertise and your experience with us today. And thank you too to Snowflake and Luxoft for sponsoring today's webinar. Before we close, just a few 18 Group events that may be of interest to you. You can sign up for our 11th of July webinar on multi-cloud environments and how to maximize data value while keeping on the right side of data privacy and security. Or you can sign up for our 5th of October RegTech Summit in London, or our 16th of November RegTech Summit in New York. So hope to see some of you there. Meantime, that's it for today. So thank you again to Paul, Chris, Iadine, and James, and thank you to all of you who've taken part in the webinar. Please complete our feedback form as we're always keen to hear your views and improve our products. Meantime, thanks again and goodbye.
Thank you.